Week 15 of the fantasy football season. He has wide receiver start sits every matchup for first week of the playoffs. First matchup, Thursday Night Football, San Francisco 49ers at the Seattle Seahawks. So we know Deebo Samuel, he's going to be out 3-4 weeks with the ankle injury, so he's not going to play in this game. But Brandon Ayuk now, he'll step up as the number one wide receiver this week here for this 49er team. And I think he can have a good game. The secondary of the Seattle Seahawks really isn't that good. And in this one, I think he can make a few plays. Him and Purdy have a pretty good chemistry over the last couple weeks since Purdy's been in the lineup here. Brandon Ayuk's a playmaker, and this season he's definitely had a good season and a bounce back here. And this week is a number 2 receiver, flex option for fantasy owners. He's a start. Now to the Seattle Seahawks, Metcalf and Lockett. Pretty much each and every week they're locked in as starters for your fantasy lineup. I know it's a pretty tough matchup versus a good defense that shut down Mike Evans and Chris Godwin in last week's ball game. But right here, Geno Smith's had a better year than Tom Brady. He has good rapport with these wide receivers. And this is a big division ball game for both teams here. So right now, I think Metcalf and Lockett could carve out a good ball game. I'm not going to say it's a great ball game, but they're both guys worthy of the start this week. Now to the Indianapolis Colts Saturday football. First of 3 games at the Minnesota Vikings. Michael Pittman, I know it's been a tough season for him. A lot of people took him in the second round of fantasy drafts here. And he's been a bust, no doubt about it. But this week, I think he could make a few plays versus secondary of the Minnesota Vikings. And we saw last week DJ Chark have a big game versus them. And we also saw Amon St. Brown do what he does best. So I think Pittman has a decent ball game. He's still a receiver that could get down the field, make plays, and has breakaway speed. And they just haven't put him in the right spots. And Matt Ryan hasn't got time as well this season to make big plays. But Pittman this week, I still got as a start. And now with Pierce and Campbell, both borderline options. This offense has just been inconsistent. Campbell's had a couple good games this season, and same with Alec Pierce, but in a playoff situation as a fantasy owner, if you're in a pinch, yeah, you're going to play him, but obviously they're borderline options because they could go either way, a 10-plus fantasy point game for these guys, or they could even go for 0 in this one for all we know. But this Viking defense has been middle of the pack for the most part. Now to the Minnesota Vikings, Justin Jefferson coming off a monster 213-yard receiving game. Obviously, he's a start each and every week and the best wide receiver in fantasy football this season. And Adam Thielen, he's been getting it going over the last couple weeks. And this Minnesota team as a whole just plays better at home. So both these guys are easy starts this week, with Thielen being a 2 flex option. Now to the Baltimore Ravens at the Cleveland Browns. DeMarcus Robinson, the number 1 wide receiver over here for this Raven team. Lamar Jackson, so far, he's been out of practice this week here for this Saturday afternoon ball game. But Robinson's a borderline option. Over the last couple weeks, he's gotten 10 fantasy points, which is still decent, but his ceiling at best is probably 15, 20 fantasy points at most you're going to get out of Robinson. But it looks like Huntley might be the starter once again in this ball game. And Devin Duvernay's a sit. He hasn't done much this season here, and especially the last few weeks. The best game he's had was 9 fantasy points, and that's pretty much his ceiling this season here for Devin Duvernay. So nothing to really say about him, but he's a sitter. Now to the Browns, Amari Cooper and People Jones have his starts. I know Cooper the last couple weeks, not the greatest of ball games, but Cooper over the last few seasons, for whatever reason, he's a better home player than he is on the road. So this week here versus middle of the pack Baltimore Ravens secondary in a division matchup here, I think Amari Cooper, he goes out there and he has a decent ball game, and I got him as a start. And Donovan People-Jones, he's been a good default threat all season, a guy who's really coming to his own over the last 5-6 weeks for this Cleveland Brown team. And him and Deshaun Watson have been connecting on some good passes over the last couple games. So right here, I got him as a start. Now to the Dolphins at the Bills Saturday Night Football. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. You load these guys up in your starting lineup each and every week. What a season it's been for Tyreek Hill. And I thought coming into the year, it just wouldn't work out with him and Tua. But Tua's getting rid of the football quick. He's taking the deep ball shots when he needs. So when Tyreek Hill's having an amazing season as the best wide receiver this year, I believe, in fantasy football. So he's a start. And Jalen Waddle, I know last week was banged up a little bit. He didn't play the greatest of games. But this week here in a big division matchup, I think Waddle gets back on it and has a good ball game in a cold ball weather game on Saturday night. Now to the Bills, Stephon Diggs, he's a start each and every week. Stud wide receiver, has a great quarterback, no doubt about it. And a no-brainer guy to put in your lineup. Gabe Davis and Isaiah McKenzie, on the other hand, just very inconsistent. I know many owners have wrote it out with Gabe Davis the whole season, including me being one of them that at least got to the playoffs with him being my number 3 wide receiver in this league. But anyway, he's a tough guy to trust. If you have better options, you obviously start him. But right now, I might have to roll him out there again if I don't like my other options on my team. But he's a guy pretty much 6-10 fantasy points. The most he's been putting up over the last 3-4 weeks here is Davis, so he's a sit. My Isaiah McKenzie, it's like one great game, one horrible game where he does nothing. So too risky, in my opinion, to start him, so he's a sit. To the Dallas Cowboys at the Jacksonville Jaguars, CeeDee Lamb having a great season here for this Cowboy team. He's a start, no doubt about it. He's a playmaker. He could go out there and he could put up monster fantasy games any week of the season. I know last week he didn't do much, but it was more about the Cowboy running game, and it was a tight game. The Texans played him great last week here, but this week here versus Jacksonville, that's definitely vulnerable to the pass. I think CeeDee Lamb busts out with a good one in this one. Needs a start. Michael Gallup, inconsistent. I know he's probably not 100% coming off the ACL from last season, so this week he's a sit. And out to the Jaguars, Christian Kirk, he's a start for me. What a surprise he's been this season. Another guy coming into the year. I didn't like the landing spot over there in Jacksonville, and we thought it was an overpay for him. But Christian Kirk, he's been a top 15 wide receiver this season in fantasy football. And if the Jaguars are trailing in this game, if it goes the opposite way in this one, you know they're going to throw a lot. And I think Kirk could be good this week as a number 2 receiver, so he's a start. And Zay Jones, he's been a hit-or-miss inconsistent wide receiver this season. But the last few weeks, last 2 out of 3 games, 20 or more fantasy points in both those games. But we know this Cowboy defense is good. I know last week Chris Moore over 120 yards in that ball game versus the Dallas Cowboys, but still this week here, I'm not going to trust Zay Jones 100% because I could see the other shoe drop and him not do much. So he's a borderline option. Now to the Falcons at the Saints. Drake London, he had one monster game a couple weeks ago. I know it's a quarterback change over here in Atlanta, but he's still not a guy I could trust 100% in a playoff ball game. So he's a sit for me. And if Lattimore's back in this game, it's a tough matchup for Drake as it is London. So now to Chris Olave, he's a start for me. This Falcon defense isn't that good. The secondary isn't great. And Chris Olave, he's been one of the better rookie wide receivers, no doubt about it, this season here for the New Orleans Saints in fantasy football. So this week, coming off a bye week, getting a little fresh, getting the nagging injuries off, I think he's a good start this week. And Jarvis Landry, it's been a tough season for him with a lot of injuries and just pretty much no production. So I think Landry's best days obviously are behind him. And who knows if next year he'll even latch on with a team. So right now, he's a sit for me, even in a decent matchup versus the Falcons. Now to the Eagles at the Chicago Bears. What am I going to say? A.J. Brown, DEVONTA Smith, one of the better 1-2 combos in the league at the wide receiver position. So these guys are must starts. And I know one game they could have an off game and do nothing, but these guys, you probably had them in your starting lineup each and every week this season here. And their starts, especially with a talented quarterback like Jalen Hurts, these guys could pop off any week. Now to the Bears, Chase Claypool and Aquarius St. Brown in a tough matchup with sits for me. I think this ball game we're going to see a lot of Cole Kmet and Justin Fields trying to do it himself in this one for the Chicago Bear team. And I know Claypool's had one good game, but besides that, he really hasn't done much. And also, I know Darnell Mooney's out. I just feel like the Bears are just going to run the football a whole lot in this game. Khalil Herbert possibly coming back as well in this one. So right now, I got both wide receivers as sits. Now to the Lions at the Jets, Amon St. Brown has his start this week. He's getting back to form like he did late last season before he came onto the scene. And DJ Chark the last few weeks here, he's a guy tough to sit after coming off 2 games with 15 or more fantasy points and finding the end zone in back-to-back games. So DJ Chark's a start for me this week here, especially if the Lions are chasing point. I could see him get some garbage time in this game here as DJ Chark. So right now as a flex option or number 3 receiver in 3 receiver leagues, he's definitely a start for me. Now to Jameson Williams, I know last week first career touchdown it was for him on a 41-yard touchdown. But after that, he only had 2 more targets and he did nothing with it. So Jameson Williams in a big ball game this week here for fantasy owners, he's tough to trust as a start. So I'm going to give him a sit on the bench. Now for the New York Jets, Garrett Wilson, he's been one of the better rookie wide receivers. And when he has a quarterback that can actually get him the ball in space for him to go out there and make plays, he's a guy that could be a top 10 receiver to 15 weekly. And this week here versus the Lions secondary, I can't stop no one. Garrett Wilson's an easy start for me, and I wouldn't be surprised if he gets 100 yards in this ball game. Elijah Moore, he had a great game last week, good targets, good fantasy day, and him and Mike White are definitely on the same page. And we saw last season, towards the end of the season, with both these guys. But I got to see at least one more game out of Elijah Moore to make him a start. So this week, a wait-and-see approach and sit him. And Corey Davis, he got banged up in the last game versus the Bills. We don't know if he's going to play. And even if he does, he really hasn't been a factor. So he's a sit for me. Now to the Steelers at the Panthers. Deontay Johnson, 12-13 fantasy points weekly at minimum, it seems like he's going to get for PPR league fantasy owners. And this week, Mitch Trubisky, if he's back in the lineup, that bodes well for Deontay Johnson, where he's a Trubisky favorite. And we saw it early in the season where he got peppered with targets was Johnson. So this week here, he's a start. George Pickens, up and down rookie season. A couple games he had goose eggs, and then a couple games he had blow-up games. But this week here, if Trubisky's starting, him and Pickens really haven't been on the same page this season. So I got him as a sit this week. A guy tough to trust in this situation. So I'll give him the sit. And now to DJ Moore, if he's going to play in this game, I got him as a start. Him and Sam Darnold actually have good chemistry. And we saw it last season where Sam Darnold was the quarterback early in the season before he was injured. DJ Moore had the best games of the season for him last year. So this week, he's a start for me. And Terrace Marshall, we haven't seen enough out of him to garner a fantasy start. Last week, what a catch he made, though, in between his legs. What it never hitting the floor, but he's not putting enough numbers to be a starter. Now to the Chiefs at the Houston Texans. JUJU Smith-Schuster, a great season here in his first year with Kansas City. And he's been a true number one for them. But also when you got Patrick Mahomes, who could get you open and thread that needle, obviously. He's a starting wide receiver, no doubt about it, for this Kansas City Chiefs team. So I like JUJU this week here. And he's pretty much him and Kelsey, the only two guys in the passing game I trust. MVS, he's not a guy I could trust weekly. He'll have one good game for 10, 15 points, and then the next game, 2-3 fantasy points. And this week in a game that could be ended early with the Chiefs up 2-3 touchdowns, where they're just running the football in the second half. I don't think MVS will do much. Kadarius Toney's been a walking injury so far in the first two seasons for him in the NFL. He's a sit for me. And Sky Moore, he's just not getting enough playing time and snaps and targets to be a guy to play this week. So those three receivers are sits. And now to the Texans, Brandon Cooks, he's been non-existent and a big fantasy bust this season. No doubt about it. So he's a sit for me. Can't trust him. Nico Collins, he's not 100%. He's had a couple good games here and there. And then some games where he disappears and doesn't do anything. So he's inconsistent. He's a sit for me. And Chris Moore, I know last week, the monster game, 10 catches, 124 yards. But are you really going to trust him in a playoff game week here for fantasy owners? Even after coming off the game, no doubt about it, you go out there and get him on your waiver wire. But a guy to put in your starting lineup, unless you got crazy injuries, there's no way I'm starting him. Now to the Patriots at the Vegas Raiders. If Jacoby Myers is back in this game, he's a start for me. One of the better and consistent wide receivers this season here for this New England Patriot team. And he's a good possession receiver. He could go out there and make plays. And we know this Raiders secondary isn't that great. We saw Ben Skoranek and a lot of backups tear up this secondary late in that ball game last week for the Rams. Now that Devontae Parker left the game with a concussion, it looked like on Monday Night Football. And even if he does play and is 100%, he's not a guy I could count on weekly. And now Nelson Aguilar, he's had a couple pop games here and there, but also another guy not fantasy value enough to put in your lineup. And this Patriot offense just is inconsistent in moving the football through the air, so they're both sits. Davante Adams, I know last week only 10 fantasy points, but this week here I know he's going to be the main focus of this Patriot defense, but he's going to get his. It's a home game, it's an indoor game, and usually throughout his career, after a bad game, he comes back with a vengeance and puts on a good one. So even in a tough matchup, he's a starter. Matt Collins, he's a sit for me. Another inconsistent wide receiver that one week you'll have a great game, and the next week, 5-8 fantasy points at most you can get out of him. So this week here, he's a sit for me. Patriots defense playing great over the last few weeks, and I could really see them bottle up Derek Carr for the most part in this one. Now to the Cardinals at the Broncos, DeAndre Hopkins, he's been great since he came off the suspension. I thought he was a little bit behind and one step slower, but he's proved me wrong for sure this season here is DeAndre Hopkins, and he's back to that number 1-2 level at wide receiver. Hollywood Brown, he's a solid wide receiver. I know Kyler Murray's out, but Colt McCoy's obviously a veteran quarterback in the league over 12 seasons where he could get the ball to the playmakers. We saw it even though it was a lot of garbage time towards the end. McCoy makes some plays. And this week here in Denver, I think he will make a few plays for these receivers and their both starts. Jerry Jeudy, finally a pop game for him. We've been waiting for all season with 3 touchdowns last week. So after coming out with a performance like that, it's going to be tough for fantasy owners to sit Jerry Jeudy this week. So this week here versus a weak Cardinals secondary, even though it looks like Russell Wilson ain't going to play in this game, I think Jeudy could make some plays. Coming off the big game, like I said, definitely could be a fluke. But after seeing that, you don't want that on your bench again. Even if he scores a touchdown, that would hurt fantasy owners. So this week is a start. Courtland Sutton, he missed last week's ball game. We don't know if he's going to play in this one, but right now, to me, he's a borderline option. Courtland Sutton, I know he's had a couple of decent games this season, and then a couple games where he's disappeared, but that's just the name of this offense over there in Denver. Nothing has been steady all season. A lot of inconsistencies with the wide receivers and the running back position, and obviously with Russell Wilson as well. But this week here, Jeudy I have as a start, and Sutton borderline. Now to the Titans. At the Chargers, this is pretty straightforward. Traylon Burks, if he comes off the concussion and plays in this game, he's a playmaker and pretty much their only legit option that could spread the field of receivers, so he's a start. And Westbrook-Ikhine and Robert Woods, not seeing enough out of him. It looks like Robert Woods' best days are behind him, unfortunately, here after a horrible season with this Titan team. And he just didn't fit in. I thought he would fit in with this obviously short passing, quick passing Titan offense, but that hasn't been the case here for Robert Woods. And hey, maybe he's not 100% after coming off the ACL last season, but he's a sick. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, you fire these guys up each and every week, and both guys had big fantasy games last week, going over 20 fantasy points for both of them. So this week here versus a Titan defense that just got shredded by the Jacksonville Jaguars, their starts. And Joshua Palmer is a borderline option. I know last week, not a great game, but now he's the third wide receiver for this Los Angeles Charger team. So he's a borderline option. Now to the Bucs at the Cincinnati Bengals. Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, I know it hasn't been a great season for them, but fantasy owners are going to be kicking themselves if they have these guys on the bench because they're still big play receivers. Evans and Brady, they're just off by a little. If they could start connecting on that deep ball here, Evans could be a huge threat, and we've seen it a couple times this season. For whatever reason, Evans has been dropping passes, or there's been penalties called back, just like last week. They hit on a 60-plus yard touchdown called back from a holding call. So right here, I think Mike Evans, he's due to have that game. I know I've been saying that for weeks here, but they're just missing on those big few plays here is Tampa Bay, and they got to get it into gear if they want to get into playoffs and make a push. And Chris Godwin still not 100% coming off that ACL injury, but once he gets going, he's one of the best possession and catch receivers in the league here. Julio Jones, he haven't seen enough out of him, but at least he's been healthy over the last few weeks, but he's still a stand. Jamar Chase, he's a start each and every week. Look back like he didn't miss a beat in last week's game, going over 25 fantasy points. Here's Jamar Chase. And this week versus Tampa secondary, I think he could make a few plays. He's a start. And T. Higgins, he's like a 1A, 1B type of situation over there for this Bengal team. So as long as Higgins plays and gets back on the field, he's a start for me, no doubt about it. In a ball game versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we saw their secondary get ripped up last week now to the New York Giants at the Washington Commanders. So right here, Darius Slayton, the number one wide receiver for this New York Giant team. And we saw him have a good ball game a couple weeks ago versus the Commanders. So with Daniel Jones, not many options to throw to this week, I got Slayton as a start. Now to Richie James Jr., he took a lick at the end of the ball game last week in that loss for the New York Giants. So he might not play in this game with a concussion. So obviously he's a sit for me. And now the guy you're going to have in fantasy leagues. And out of the Commanders, Scary Terry McLaurin, I have him as a start. I know the last few weeks the numbers haven't been all that great, but this week here I think he could exploit that Giants secondary a little bit here. So I got him as a start. And Curtis Samuel, he's just been inconsistent over the last few weeks. I know he could put up numbers, but him and Taylor Heineke really haven't been on the same page. So Curtis Samuel I have as a sit. And Jahan Dotson, I know he scored a touchdown a couple weeks ago versus Giant team, but he pretty much hasn't done much. And now to the last game of the week, the Los Angeles Rams at the Green Bay Packers. So right here, the Rams, they're going to have Baker Mayfield, the quarterback. And Von Jefferson, I know, found the end zone last week. I know Ben Skoranek had over 90 yards receiving. But come on, in a playoff game here, no way you're going to start these guys. So they're easy sits for me, with obviously no more teams on buys and everyone playing, so they're sits. And out of the Packers, Christian Watson, he's been a top 5 wide receiver over the last few weeks here with 9 touchdowns in the last 4 ball games. So right here, he's a start for me. There's no way you could sit him. He's been a dynamic player and possibly in the running for the Rookie of the Year, and obviously one of the better rookie wide receivers, even though the first 8-9 weeks of the season he pretty much was non-existent for fantasy football. Allen Lazard's a borderline option. Right now, like I said, Christian Watson is the number one man over there. And Lazard, he's missed on a couple plays over the last few weeks where you thought he'd have a good fantasy day. But right now, if you're in a pinch, you definitely go out there and play him in a decent matchup. But I got him in borderline, and Mr. Reliable Randall Cobb, it could be going either way here for Cobb. He could either have a good game or a bad game. But this week here, like I said, with all the bye weeks over and it's a playoff week this week, I got Randall Cobb as a sit. So that's week 15 start to sit at the wide receiver position of every game for the fantasy football season.